I'd like to acknowledge Australia's First Nation people as the traditional custodians of the land, and for this episode in particular, the Palawa people. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging.
Making the wines in a real winery now, we're filtering, it has definitely been an incredible journey and I have just learnt so much, and I'm so grateful to have had those opportunities to do what I've done.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale.
Alice Davidson has a real sense of style. She's a globe-trotting wanderer who isn't afraid to forge her own path. Aunt Alice is her brand, where she makes delicious, quaffable art from cool climate grapes grown in Tasmania. Hey Alice, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Shanteh. That's very nice of you, all of that. Make me sound great.
Well, you do make delicious wine, but you are a kind of artistic kind of soul, so I kind of wanted to put a bit of a spin on it like that. But tell me a little bit about your upbringing. What kind of childhood did you have? You grew up in the Adelaide Hills, is that right?
Yeah, we did. We grew up in a tiny little town called Houghton, just up in the hills, sort of to the more northeast of Adelaide. And my father was a panel beater and had his own panel shop, which was at our house. And my mum worked at the Teachery Gully Council for about 35 years. And our property actually backed onto a giant unused quarry that was huge. I mean, maybe if I went back it wouldn't be so big, but as a kid it seemed massive. And we lived a pretty typical 1980s, 90s upbringing, I'd say, where we were pretty unsupervised and we spent a lot of time, my little brother Mitch and my older sister Corrie, in that quarry, yabbing in the dams, picking blackberries, wandering through the creeks, climbing on rusty old unused machinery and falling off. Safe, very safe. But yeah, it was a really outdoorsy upbringing, and we were sort of left to manage ourselves a lot and just make our own fun. And I remember that fondly, and exploring with my brother and picking blackberries and, yeah, being pretty connected to the earth, I guess.
So it kind of makes me think of like Alice with the amazing immune system.
Oh, yeah, maybe, although now I have a 2-year-old, that's definitely not the immune system that's that good.
Talking about like an outdoorsy kind of childhood like that, I had a kind of similar one, and it makes me think of how much you need to use your imagination as a child, you know, being that you're kind of, you know, got this great space, but you really need to kind of occupy your mind. Is that how you got into geology?
Yeah, I'd say so. As I said, my father was a panel beater, but our family was a very sciencey kind of family. Like my dad actually studied engineering at Adelaide Uni, and my sister, who's about 5 or 6 years older than me, she did a PhD at Adelaide Uni in chemistry, biochemistry. My brother went through Adelaide Uni, did a science degree and ended up becoming a geologist. And I think it was just that connection to sort of the land and spending a lot of time outdoors. And I actually remember one of my earliest memories is actually making maps of the quarry, and there was this other sort of patch of land across the road from our house that was like Crown land, and it was the road runoff. And I remember like drawing these kind of maps as a kid of the road runoff, and there was, you know, this wild fennel growing, and I used to kind of make these maps, and I mean, they weren't overly, you know, complicated or anything, but they were just, you know, a child's interpretation of the land. And I remember doing that specifically. So it was kind of a natural thing that I led towards, and I just started doing my science degree. Sort of my father encouraged me, and I did well in school, science, maths, did lots of maths, physics, chemistry, all of that, and did pretty well always at school. Our parents were pretty strict on us about getting good grades, and then that sort of just naturally led me to science and then into the geology, because I just liked that, yeah, that sort of earthy, soilsy plants, you know, landscapes, waterways, all of that. I sort of just naturally lent towards all of that.
I mean, it's a nifty skill to have that kind of knowledge in your back pocket when it comes to wine, and obviously a really natural progression into the natural world of kind of growing and farming. Do you have a first memory of wine, or did that come later after you've kind of travelled?
Yeah, I wouldn't say we were a big wine family. My dad would drink the occasional red wine. He sort of, had sparkling red wine at Christmas. And my mum did like a glass of sparkling wine, but they weren't really big drinkers, and I wouldn't say I'd have any real distinct memories from my childhood. My first memories really of really getting into wine myself and drinking it are probably when I was in uni doing that undergrad degree, science. We lived in a share house in Adelaide in Myland, and it was really hot, and we were three young, crazy girls, 19 or so, however old we were, 19, 20. And we were broke, dead broke. And on the weekends, we used to buy 5-litre bags of goon. And it sounds crazy that is my first memory, but it honestly is. I never really was much of a beer drinker. Like, I don't drink beer at all anymore. And I sort of never liked it, never really liked any spirits. They were all, I don't know, I just didn't like them. I just always liked wine. And sadly, those were my first sort of memories. But even then, drinking, those bagged wines, I remember we sort of every weekend we'd sort of buy a different one, and we'd like grade them and rate them. So we sort of started off on, like the classic fruity Lexia. And we were like, I remember thinking, God, this is a bit like sweet. It's kind of okay, but it's a bit fruity, a bit sweet. So, we got down. I remember every weekend we'd get a different one, and we'd sort of, be like, oh, this one's a bit too much like this one's a bit too much like that. And, when you're drinking 5 litres of it, it sort of needs to be all right. So I think eventually we whittled it down to the berry fresh dry white was the sort of most palatable boxed wine. So, maybe not the most high-flying first memory, but still was really into those wines, and, was sort of grading and rating and was aware of those quality differences, even in the most bogan way.
Look, it's a rite of passage. And also, I think it's really important, if somebody is in the wine industry and they don't have a goon bag story, I think they're lying, because, they were major. And yeah, like you said, if you're drinking 5 litres of the stuff, I can see why you'd gravitate towards drier styles, because otherwise you're just really ill the next day, aren't you?
That's it. I mean, we were probably ill the next day anyway, but I'm not going to say that was because of the wine. That was probably more to the level of consumption. But yes, we're all young ones.
Well, Mike Benny, still to this day, I think does, a kind of goon bag kind of, tasting and reviews of all of them. And it's so, yeah, I remember him sending me a photo of them being dropped off to his house, and I was like, oh man, that is a lot. I mean, that's a lot of storage. You think wine's bad, but when you're looking at 5 litres.
Oh, good on him. There you go.
Yeah, exactly. Now tell me a little bit about traveling the world. After uni, where did you go and what did you do, and where did wine come to play a part in that journey?
Yes, so I travelled. I actually did a gap year. I did 1 year of uni, and then I had a gap year where, like every young good Aussie, I went to London and worked in a bar. And I was working in pubs in London and up sort of in the English countryside for sort of about 6 months. And just that exposure to not so much wine, but just, I guess, the service industry, hospitality industry, and being obviously in Europe, that exposure to, all wines. Like, it's not like Australia where there's lots of Australian wine served. If you go to your local pub, it's like there's French, Spanish, Italian, like just a really sort of diverse, beverage landscape in London. So that was probably the start of the travel. I was 19 at the time. I came back after that year, gap year, and I sort of travelled around a lot in that year to Europe, like Germany, went to Oktoberfest, drank a lot of beer. That's where my my now distaste of beer comes from. I drank a bit too much in that Oktoberfest. And yeah, went through Spain, Germany, and I was sort of touching on these wine regions and these wines throughout that time, but I still didn't have it in my mind. Still hadn't really clicked to sort of study wine and to make that a career, although there was always that sort of interest there and that, that always interest in food, wine, cooking, and, just exploring my palate. The traveling sort of continued. After uni, I went to Canada and I worked at vintage at a place called Cedar Creek, which is in British Columbia in the Okanagan Valley, which is beautiful. And that was after uni. So that's more where that wine, then I was sort of tuned in and everything sort of started to come together then. The travel, the food and wine, I'd gone back to uni and studied the degree then. So I had the theory behind everything, and it all just sort of started coming together. And that's when I really thought, yeah, this is in my veins. This is me. This is so me. And it just, that was, I guess, the start. And that was about 10 years ago. So not too long ago. But yeah, travel, it's just so good. Just opens your mind. It was a good thing to do, to travel a lot when I was young. I think it really has shaped who I am and shapes my winemaking to be open-minded and adaptable, changeable. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, especially I think when you're getting into wine to start with, being somewhere like Canada where you understand the language would have been really important too, because it can be kind of off-putting when, you're trying to understand what someone's saying, let alone working out, all these technical jargon and everything like that. So the Okanagan's a wonderful spot to kind of dip your toes in.
That's right. And I'd already actually lived in Canada before that, about 5 years before I went back for that trip. I lived for 2.5 years in Banff in Alberta, and I just loved everything about Canada and the people. And yeah, they're kind of like Australians in many ways, I think. Very laid back, very casual, very down to earth, and just trying to sort of make the best wines they can. And it's a cool climate, I guess, in British Columbia, but quite different in that it's got quite a big diurnal shift and a seasonal shift. So it's obviously, freezing, literally under snow in winter, and then right through to, 45 degrees plus, like when I landed in that vintage in 2015, which was the year that the horrendous bushfires swept through Washington and California. And a lot of Cedar Creek's vineyards were actually right down south on the border with Washington. So a lot of their fruit was really, really heavily affected by smoke taint. So it was, devastating and, unbelievable all at the same time to work in that winery. I'd only done a couple of vintages at that point at Darrenburg. So sort of, a total rookie, and I remember just pumping over tanks and just thinking, God, like, is it just me, or does this tank, it just smells like an ashtray? Like, it was insane.
Oh no, that's so incredibly sad, because like you said, they wouldn't have had much probably experience with something like that. And then, oh no. So what did you do? Did you say anything? I mean, is it your place to say anything?
I mean, they knew, but they were just, doing the best they could, sort of pushing through. They weren't really sure what to do. It was a new winemaker, that vintage too. It had been Daryl Brooker for many years, an Aussie guy. And they just hired a new winemaker, Alexis Moore, who was she was a Kiwi. She'd been working at Saracen Estate in New Zealand for a long time. And yeah, they would just, I mean, now I think it's sort of coming to the realization that there's not a lot you can do with smoke taint, and it's almost better in a lot of instances to just not pick that fruit and to sort of, just try again next year. But they were picking everything. And yeah, they just trying to sort of just cover it up with oak and that sort of thing. But it was pretty devastating. Some of the fruit was okay, like some of the fruit from further north. So it was still, or some of the stuff they sort of got off earlier, some of the whites and sparkling. So still learnt a lot that vintage, but yeah, pretty incredible thing to see, to witness sort of firsthand.
Yeah, and just not typical of what those regions, see. I mean, they do get a lot of sunshine out there in saying that though, don't they? Because they've got peaches and cherries and amazing stone fruit that grows out that way.
That's it. It's a huge primary production region, the Okanagan Valley, and it's got both that massive diurnal shift where it's really cold at night, really hot during the day, and that huge seasonal shift where they make that ice wine in Canada. It gets freezing, the vines are under snow, and then next minute it's 45 degrees. So and quite hilly, not dissimilar to Tasmania in many ways. Very, the aspect and the individual sort of site selection of the vineyards makes a huge difference to the end product of the wine, whether they're, slightly shifted to the east or the west or the north. And the beautiful big river through the middle there, the Okanagan River. Very similar to sort of the Huon Valley where I am now. So,
wow, yeah, that's definitely something that's got to stay with you. When you returned back to Australia, what was your first kind of winemaking post here?
So while I was doing that vintage, a job had come up online for an associate winemaker at Norfolk Rise Vineyard, which is in Mount Benson, which is a region next to Robe, which is a little town that a lot of people know, a little fishing village. And I had met about a year previously to that my now partner and husband, Tom, and he was living in Robe in a shed, in a very humble abode. And would you believe it, all I wanted to do was go back to Robe and live in his shed with him. So this job came up at Norfolk Rise. And so I jumped at it. I didn't have a lot of, knowledge of the region. I'd been there quite a few times. Actually, one of my good girlfriends, Kate Foreman, was living in Robe at the time. So I knew the town well. And I interviewed over online for that job when I was in Canada and landed it. And then that was the start of that journey at Norfolk Rise Vineyard, which took me, I was there 4 years in the end. And that was sort of the real official, that was kind of my big break, I guess. And that's where I really learnt, the nuts and bolts of getting wine from the vineyard through to bottle in a commercial sense. Yeah.
I love some of the regions down that way. We probably don't talk about them as much as we should. Can you tell me a little bit about Mount Benson and Robe, or a couple of things that you think you wish people knew more about, perhaps the winemaking in that area? Yeah,
like you said, they're not very spoken about, and I think they are probably a couple of the most underrated regions in Australia, I think. They are very small in terms of the quantity of grapes and the geographical area. And so there's Robe, which is its own wine region, which is from sort of the township of Robe south. And then that borders the Mount Gambier wine region, which is also very underrated and up and coming, really cool climate. And then there's the Mount Benson region, which borders to the north of Robe and continues up, sort of back up through Kingston, towards Adelaide. So very small regions. And then I guess they're all part of sort of the greater Limestone Coast region. And I guess they've sort of always been in the shadow of the Coonawarra. And I think that is possibly has been traditionally may be a part of the problem. The Coonawarra like makes beautiful wines, you know, Cabernet, and they've got a really strong identity. And I think maybe in the early days of the Robin Mount Benson winemaking era, they sort of were in that shadow and didn't really quite know how to break free of that and sort of just be their own regions, because it's quite hard because they were small. There's, you know, not that many wineries, not that many vineyards. So, but I think that's in the end what they really needed to do, because it is so much closer to the ocean. Like Marobe and Mount Benson, right, you know, border the ocean. They are, you know, geographically so different to the Coonawarra. So there's no way that they could try and come under that Coonawarra banner. And they really needed to forge their own path. And I think that's starting to happen now. And, you know, the Syrah Shiraz, it is sort of more in that Syrah style. It's cool climate. And people think South Australia, you know, they think it is probably a bit warmer than it is. It is really cold down there. Like, you go to Robe, you got to pack a jumper. Like, it is cold. It is windy. And that, you know, isn't so good when you're a tourist in January and you're trying to work on your tan. But that is good for beautiful, cool climate, vibrant, you know, acid-driven Syrah and Cabernet and Merlot and whites, Pinot Gris, you know, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay. Particularly, I think Mount Gambier is starting to sort of get a bit of more of a reputation for fantastic Chardonnay. So it's a region with incredible potential, and it just, you know, it's sort of small and mighty is what I would say, but with enormous potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fascinating, the regions, the soil profiles, the different eras of soils that can be traced back going all the way into those caves. But you've also got that kind of the East Avenue and the kind of the East Dairy ranges. Does that kind of really kind of protect or kind of, is that a bit of a buffer from the Southern Ocean?
No, it's so exposed. You know, it's windy and wild, and that is probably the biggest significant factor in the climate of that region. It, you know, now living in Tassie, when I fly back to Adelaide, I'm just like, oh my God, it's so flat. It's just flat as a tack, and it is honestly just, it's an ancient desert, and it really is. But it was underwater, well, down near Robe. It's an ancient sea. So what you get is this sort of undulating, rolling hill, like not even hills, just rolling, you know, mounds, you know, really not very, they're not hills, but they're, you know, the vineyards are kind of, you get these patches where it's a bit more sandy, which is the lee, you know, the ex-lee side of the dune. And then you get a patch on the other side, which is slightly different, which would have been the other side of the dune. And then it's just the wind. So you get, there's this phenomena, the Bonnie upwelling, which is really prevalent. Everyone knows it down there. It is when these really cold air fronts come literally straight from Antarctica, move up through, you know, literally hit the shore right at Robe and Mount Benson and Kingston. And as that wind comes up, it pulls the ocean currents with it, and that freezes the wind, and then that just blasts the coasts and it cools the vineyards. And, you know, if that wind comes at the wrong time, like there's been a few vintages when I was there when that wind came right at flowering. So in spring is a time when it typically is quite windy. You know, that can sort of disrupt the flowering, the buds of the, you know, future grape bunches. And that's where you get like hen and chicken and uneven ripening. But when those winds come in sort of January, February, March, when your bunches are already formed and they're strong enough to take that wind, it's really good at just preventing diseases. It aerates canopies, and it keeps that beautiful, cool climate healthy. It just makes it easier to make good wine down there without having to use a lot of sprays. You can sort of be a little bit more hands-off and just let the grapes go through their natural ripening and then pick when it's ready, and the grapes are still in pretty good shape. So it's quite, the wind, even though it's frustrating to be in the wind all the time, it's quite helpful for your winemaking and your vineyards.
Well, yeah, you need something to keep you sane. They say that like really windy areas do make people go a bit batty. So I suppose, but if you've got
that's
wine,
why I'm batty. We'll blame it on that. Hey?
Never. But I mean, I think it's pretty cute that you wanted to live in a shack with your hunk of a man and you didn't care where it was. I love that.
That's it. I'm always up for an adventure, pretty open-minded, and it was good times in that shed. I mean, it was a nice shed. It was lined, We didn't have a lot of worries. We had a nice bit of land, a couple of hectares and little garden, and yeah, that was sort of before kids. So we did a lot of surfing, a lot of fishing, made some wine. It was pretty good times.
I love that. I mean, surfing, I'm not so sure. It looks sharky. I mean, I'm just looking at maps right now and I'm like, yeah, that looks great white territory kind of area.
Oh, my husband will tell you, nah, it's not. He hasn't seen him there. Maybe it's I think it's too cold for sharks. We'll keep telling ourselves that, all right?
Yeah, exactly. Now, tell me a little bit about, the sea change and the move even further south. How did that all come about?
Yeah, so we were in Robe. Tom was there about 12 years and I was there about 8 years. And along that time, so I was making wine at Norfolk Rise. I started Aunt Alice in that time in my second vintage at Norfolk Rise because it was, obviously, a commercial brand. We were making incredible wines at unbelievably low prices. Like the wines were selling for $20 and we were winning, trophies. But the brand, it was very, not conservative, but just, it was pretty straight edge. And I don't think anyone, when talking about me, would say I'm straight edge. So I just wanted to explore, experiment, just sort of feel, limitless, and just make the wine that I wanted to make without sort of having to answer to anyone. So I started Aunt Alice. It was one barrel in the shed of, it was mainly Pinot Noir, because I, again, had seen this region that they were making a lot of Syrah and Cabernet, but I just saw this huge opportunity for like those true cool climate varieties like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which sort of weren't really being utilised. They weren't being talked about. They were sort of just being sold off by companies. Norfolk Rise had a couple of Pinot Noir vineyards, but they weren't even making the wine from them. They were mothballed. And in my 4 years there, I managed to get them to actually bottle that Pinot, and it was pretty good. And so the more and more I went along, being allowed to sort of make the wines I wanted under my own brand, Aunt Alice, I was moving away from Syrah and Pinot Gris and Cabernet, and I was just becoming more and more obsessed with Pinot Noir and in particular Chardonnay. And so obviously my budget doesn't allow me to drink Burgundy every night, unfortunately. So in my drinking, I began to drink more and more like great Australian examples of Pinot and Chard, and that drew me to Tasmania. Also, Norfolk Rise was owned by the Kreglinger Group, which had Piper's Brook, still has Piper's Brook in its portfolio. So I was going down a bit to Tamar Valley, Piper's River, to Piper's Brook for sort of management meetings and all of that sort of thing. And so I was just getting this slow, steady exposure to Tassie and its wines and its people. And I guess it just sucked me in. And here we are.
Yeah, Tassie tends to do that. Tell me about the name Aunt Alice. How did that come about?
Well, Aunt Alice originally was actually going to be a condiment and preserve shop in Adelaide on Goodwood Road.
No way. Had you copyrighted the
so
awesome.
Well, it was going to be like, I don't know what it was going to be. It was, it was one of these things. It was a work in progress, something that I'd thought about, on 12-hour bus rides in Turkey. It was going to be like a wine shop. Like we were going to say, it was going to be like a bottler with selling wine, selling condiments and stuff that I'd made, jams, pickles. It was just going to be, I guess, like this flavor shop. I don't know how to describe it, but just hot sauces, chutney, just, everything like this. And at the time, so this was before I'd even met Tom, I was just an aunt, and it was going to be a bit, a bit loopy, a bit kooky, and I was, an aunt to my two beautiful nephews, Chase and Darcy. And I just thought Aunt Alice, it kind of has that, that matriarchal vibe, that cooking, those family recipes, that secret tip, like, this brand of this certain sauce or blah, blah, blah. Like, it kind of was born from that. And then it sort of morphed into, when I got the winemaking job, it sort of just naturally, organically evolved into what it is today, which is my wine brand. Still all about flavor, but just just wine now. I still make my little pickles and do my cooking, but not commercially. But maybe when I go into retirement, I can focus more on the chutneys.
You've put it out there now, and I feel like you really need to have some kind of small offering of a crazy weird chutney, maybe something weird from Tassie, throw in some things you don't expect.
Yeah. Pepperberry or something. Yeah. Well, we've got this weird tree that's growing in our backyard, actually, that we don't know what it is. We're calling it a chum, and it's like a cherry plum. So maybe I can make chum jam.
It's got a ring to it.
Chum jam. Aunt Alice's chum. It doesn't sound good, does it? Might have to send that one back to the marketing team, I reckon.
Well, tell me if your nieces and nephews, if they could describe you, would they say that you were the fun aunt or the crazy aunt or the weird, wacky and wonderful aunt?
Yeah, probably all of those things. Yeah, they would describe me as the crazy aunt. Always with a drink in hand, always wanting to have some fun, try something new. Love them dearly, take them to the park. I mean, obviously moving down here, we've got no family down here in Tas, so I'm missing them dearly. They just came down recently for Dark Mofo, which was awesome. They stayed with us. We went to the winter feast and, tried lots of different things there. They had some ice cream and all sorts of beautiful, delicious, weird and wonderful things, which I got for them. So yeah, they probably think I'm a bit weird, I guess.
I love it. I feel like I need an Auntie Alice in my life to take me to Dark Mofo and do those fun things.
That's it. We all do.
Now tell me a bit about your two wines, or your Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. I suppose Ocean is a little self-explanatory, but just run me through the wines that you make.
Yeah, so in 2022 was the first vintage of Aunt Alice, the Tassie version. And so 2016 through to 2021, making wines in Road Mount Benson, and had a few more wines in the range, had a kind of crazy red, weird blend, chillable red thing that was like Pinot-esque with like God knows what else, Riesling, Savvy, whatever else tasted good on the vine, lots of whites and reds together. And I made the Pinot Night Sky from 2017 vintage on. So I feel like the Pinot's probably had the biggest evolution. So 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. And then the 23 Pinot is in barrel. So about seventh year on that one. And just really, I guess when you've got your own brand, the beauty in it is that you can just make the wine that you want to drink, as selfish as that is. And you don't have to please anyone. You don't feel obliged to do anything the same year after year. You can source fruit from different regions, different vineyards. And I guess when I first started making in 2016, 17, 18, those first three vintages were quite experimental and probably a bit more sort of natty in their ways. I'm still wild ferment, but I'm using a little bit more new oak these days. Still, yeah, pretty hands-off, but I'm filtering these days. So it's been an evolution of, personal kind of taste. But every year I'd say there's that theme of I'm just making the Chardonnay and the Pinots that I like to drink. And as my taste has evolved, as I sort of zoned in, I guess, on Tasmania in particular as like a Chardonnay producing region and Pinot, obviously, I'm sort of more and more making those wines, just morphing into those wines that I love to drink, which is vibrant, fresh, speaking to where they come from, and yet supported by winemaking. I think, there's that big saying, the best wine's made in the vineyard. Well, is it? I mean, if you dump a ton of grapes at the winery and don't do anything to it, it's not going to taste good. There, you still got to make it into wine. So I know what they're trying to say when they say that, but you've still got to get it from a grape into a bottle. There's a few months out there. And it's just being hands off, but having that intuition to do what needs to be done and to work with what you've got. And I guess that's probably what comes back to Norfolk Rise, what I learned, just tasting those grapes in the vineyard. And it's just like when you're cooking, you just taste what you've got and like make the best thing you can make from that ingredient and what that ingredient is giving you. Is it a high acid? Does it need softening with, sugar or fat? Same with grapes, and that's, I guess, been the evolution there.
I love that. And I also think it's really important, especially when you're starting out as a emerging brand, to tell the story. And it's not like you go, I made my first vintage, I nailed it, it's perfect, I'll just keep doing that year after year. So I think it's really great to be able to kind of take, the consumer and the people buying your wine, your friends, along for the ride and what you're learning year in, year out. And I just think it's a really open way of telling a story.
100%. And if anyone that bought that first vintage wants a refund, that's fine. Get in touch. More honesty, always a thing from me. We actually destemmed the grapes from that first vintage in 2016 through a crab net because we didn't have a destemmer. So my husband and I, we were just on either end of this crab net, literally shaking it as hard as we could, and that's how we destemmed the grapes that first vintage into the nully bin. So making the wines in a real winery now, we're filtering, it has definitely been an incredible journey, and I have just learnt so much, and I'm so grateful to have had those opportunities to do what I've done. It's been amazing.
Well, look, there are elements of oyster shell in Chablis. I reckon a little hint of crustacean ain't so bad. There might be more demand for that 2016 going forward.
I don't even know where it is. We weren't even legal then. We were just bootlegging to family, and like it was a barrel and it wasn't even real. And then everyone was like, "Oh no, we need more." That was good. It was good. Make more.
I'm sad that you don't have a little put away so I could look at it with you one day.
I think we do. It's all under Ocean's bed, which is hilarious. Her room is full of
It's wine. So good. I love it. I love it. You're amazing. Alice, if you had to choose 3 drinks that you could drink for the rest of your life, what would they be and why?
Yes. So I found this question quite hard. And I guess I'm pretty simple, to be honest. Like I as I've alluded to a few times throughout our chat, I mainly drink Chardonnay. That's what I drink 90% of the time. So I had to have a bit of a think. But then I did remember, and I would have to drink it, and it's something that came from my Canada days. And it's called, I really want to emphasize that it is not a Bloody Mary, and it is nothing like a Bloody Mary. It's the Canadian version, and it's called a Caesar cocktail, and it has a sort of tomatoey base, but it's quite thinned out. Yeah, it's clam juice, that's it, but that sounds gross too. So it's not, I don't want to put people off. It's like this incredibly complex, like depth of flavor. It's kind of like when you put fish sauce in a stew, like the fish sauce on its own is obviously gross, but then when you put it in something, it's like, better. And then you put like Worcestershire sauce, Tabasco, heaps of salt, heaps of pepper, lots of lemon, like olives. And it's, it's like a meal in itself. And then you can have it with like gin or vodka. And they are delicious. And it's all I drank for my entire time in Canada. And when I stepped off the plane for that vintage back then in 2015, that's the first thing I did. I just went straight to the nearest bar and said, "Give me a Caesar." and I love them to this day. So that would be definitely one. And then the second would obviously be Chardonnay. Chardonnay, you talked about Chablis, that oyster shell character. Like, I think within Chardonnay as a grape, you can get such a huge variety. Like, you can have that Chablis that's like driving, fresh, steely, astute wines through to, your Montrachet, your Chassagne, like rich, voluptuous, oaky, and then you've got your domestic versions of that, Yarra Valley, Tassie, every possible, incantation of that grape you can get, every mood you're in. So I don't really think you need to drink anything other than Chardonnay. So, the third drink, I was like, oh, what would it be? Like maybe Pinot, but probably, to be honest, or like a dirty martini or something, but probably just more Chardonnay, probably.
Perfect. So we can put down all Chardonnay, including a cask of Colombard Chardonnay to ode to the good old days.
That's it. What percentage of berry fresh dry white is Chardonnay? That's my question to Berry.
I love it. Don't forget where you come from. It's very important.
No, SA through and through.
I love it. Chardonnay, more Chardonnay, and a bit of a Caesar. I think I can get down with that for sure.
Love it.
Alice, it's been such a privilege hearing more about you. I could easily chat to you for the rest of the day. Aunt Alice is doing incredibly well. It's selling out all over the place. If you do see a bottle, grab it up while you can. And thank you so much for joining me today. It's been a total joy.
Thank you so much, Shanteh. I love this podcast. You do good things. It's unbelievable. I have a 55-minute drive to work every day and I listen to it a lot. It's great. Thanks.
Well, thanks for having me in your ears, and I'll chat to you soon. Cheers to you, Alice.
Thank you.
This is Over a Glass. I'm Shanteh Wale. Stay tuned for more stories from the world of wine and drinks. Listen in every Thursday on your podcast app. Follow us on Instagram at overaglasspod and contact us at overaglass@deepintheweeds.com.au.